Hello, welcome to the One Life Church devotional series where we cover the entire Bible in 20 months. Well, the chapters today are 1 Kings chapter 3. We're going to hurry through that text because it's a very well-known chapter. And 1 Corinthians chapter 11. How do you like my cap? This is applicable to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. You'll see that in a moment. In 1 Kings chapter 3, Solomon marries the Egyptian, brings her to his home, and then he has this dream. He's ready. He spent hours waiting on God, sacrificing before him, and he has this dream where there's this dialogue with God, and he says, Lord, I'm young, I'm inexperienced, please give me wisdom. And so God says, because you did not ask for wealth, because you didn't ask for a long life, because you didn't ask for your death of your enemies, you weren't selfish. He said, you could have asked for comfort, kill all your enemies. You could have asked for a long life, and you could have been extremely selfish about what you asked for, but you didn't. You asked to get wisdom so you could rule God's people. God said, I commend that. And because you've asked for that, because your heart's in the right place, I'm going to give you peace and wealth and long life. And then we hear this incredible story of Solomon and the two prostitutes who were squabbling over whose child had died and whose child hadn't. Fascinating reading. You'll enjoy reading it. But the big issue today is the highly contentious subject, certainly in the Corinthians times, of head coverings. Now, with a head like mine, a hat's a great idea. But what's going on in this particular chapter? Well, there are a number of things. Firstly, it's a very licentious city, hugely promiscuous. And so Paul is talking more about modesty here than about fashion sense. Number two, he's writing into an environment where women were considered an inferior species. There was no equality in value even of a woman and a man. They weren't even counted as worthy of voting or worthy of being constituted in a synagogue, etc. And then thirdly, we need to understand the context here is not husband and wife. We will deal with the relationship of husband and wife in later chapters, but this is men and women in society. And so let's get right into it. In verse 3, he says, but I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of every woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Now, he's not talking here about an authority structure. In this verse, that word head is source. So he's just describing, he said, fact of the matter is, man was created out of God's genius, out of nothingness, and woman was taken from the side of a man. So he's talking about source here at this particular stage. Then he says, every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his source. But every woman who prays and prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her source. And it's the same as having her head shaved. Now, fashion aside for the moment, the fact of the matter is here, women are prophesying and women are praying, which is something which was unheard of in that ancient world. I mean, the Christian faith puts women in a totally different category in antiquity, in the ancient times. Verse 6, for if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have had her hair cut off. But if it is a disgrace for a woman to shave off her head, then she should cover her head. If it is a disgrace. Now let me ask you this question. Is it a disgrace for a woman to shave her head today? For a woman to have my fancy hairstyle? It's not a disgrace. It doesn't mean she's a prostitute today, like it did in those days. So he's saying, if it is a disgrace, well, she should have it covered. He's talking here about a dignity in worship. And he's talking very definitely into that cultural context where cutting short hair was a disgraceful thing. So he's saying, don't make that an obstruction in worship. A man ought not, this is verse 7, ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but a woman is the glory of man, for man did not come from woman, but a woman from man. She's just stating a fact that this is source a creation fact. Now, Ramsey, one of the commentators, explains that this word here, authority, is the word exousia. So it's not meaning woman here is subject to man. It means that the head covering is the sign of authority. So he's basically saying, when a man hasn't got his head covered, there's a sign of authority that he can pray and prophesy. When a woman's got her head covered, it's a sign of authority. She can pray and she can prophesy. Nevertheless, a woman is not independent of a man, or a man independent of a woman. Verse 12 says, for woman come from man, and so man also is born of woman. He's saying women and men are equally important, and they have the authority of God. Listen, if a woman is prophesying, who's she prophesying when man says she can prophesy, or because she's under God's authority? That's what he's talking about here. Remember, we're not talking husband and wife here. We're talking men and women. We do not believe that women are universally subject to men. The tramp, I'm looking out my window here, there's a homeless man outside. My wife is not subject to that man just because he's masculine. The Bible doesn't teach that. This context is one of modesty within the context that we're writing in. Different story within husband and wife, and we'll deal with that at a later time. The chapter goes on to talk about communion, and Paul's got a couple of problems with them with communion. Firstly, there's divisions, fights among them, and then they break bread. There's drunkenness, and then they break bread. There's hunger, and then some people are, scoffing down on the communion table and gorging themselves, and while others are going hungry. And he's saying, listen, you need to examine yourselves before you worship. This chapter is that of dignity and propriety when it comes to worship. God bless you.